To be a black man is to be seen before you are known, judged before you are understood. We are feared and fetishized, hunted and copied, told we are not enough or we are too much. But beneath that noise, beneath the trauma, lies something sacred.
What it do, y'all? So today, we're gonna talk about something that's been on my mind for a minute. Something I think a lot of brothers feel, but don't always get the space to break it down. We're talking about modern black men, not the performance stuff, not the caricature, but the real work of reclaiming, redefining what it means to be a man in a world that was never really built for us, never had us in mind. Because let's be honest, modern black manhood often shows up somewhat like a broken mirror, a funhouse reflection, distorted by white power structure that's always defined us by what we lack. Welcome back to our channel. I'm Haas.
I'm CC.
Today we got a hot topic for you. We're conditioned to model ourselves after dominant ideals of white masculinity. Stoicism, emotional detachment, hyper-individualism, and power achieved through control. These traits are often mistaken for strength because they are rewarded by institutions like corporate success and social credibility, or even safety from perceived threats. But for black men who navigate a world that criminalizes their existence, this mimicry becomes a survival strategy with damaging consequences. And when you're raised in a system that sees you as a problem to be managed, not a person to be nurtured, the survival instincts kick in. A lot of us, consciously or not, start modeling ourselves after the version of manhood that gets rewarded in this world. You know the one. Power measured by control, status, and domination. And because that model is built into everything, from the boardroom to the block, it gets mistaken for strength. You get praised for holding it all in, but never breaking, for being real. But here's the truth that doesn't get said enough. That version of manhood, white patriarchal masculinity, born out of colonial violence and capitalistic logic, ain't made to liberate us. It's made to contain us. It teaches us to bury our pain in silence, to fear vulnerability, to treat connection like a weakness. And in doing that, it makes us more useful to the system. Because black men are out here surviving real trauma daily. Police violence, mass incarceration, economic shutout. We carry some of the highest rates of PTSD, yet we're the least likely to seek therapy. We're suspended more as boys, ignored more as victims, punished more as men. And when we internalize that pain with no outlet, when we mistake domination for dignity, it doesn't just harm us. It spills over into our relationships, our families, our communities. We start replicating the same harms we've been trying to escape. Aggression instead of care. Control instead of trust. And too often, we leave women, queer folk, and other black men holding the weight of wounds we never learned how to name. So if we're serious about liberation, real liberation, then we can't just fight the system outside of us. We have to fight what has been programmed within us.
Now, before we get into how Black men have learned to cope, how they've adapted and survived under the weight of white supremacy, I want us to pause, to take it back, way back to who we were before the chains, before the trauma, before the struggle became our primary narrative. Because before the chains came, there were crowns.
See, we weren't always fighting to prove our worth in a world built to erase us. We didn't start off trying to survive masculinity. We defined it. We were astronomers, doctors, philosophers. We were architects and poets, scholars and kings. And yeah, we were warriors too. Not brutes, not savages, but strategists. We knew how to build civilizations and defend them.
And if you want an example of that balance of intellect and force, of empire and honor, look no further than the Moors. These weren't just mythological figures in dashikis. The Moors were real. They were Black Berbers and African Muslims who crossed into Spain in 711 CE under Tariq ibn Ziyad, and they held it down for nearly 800 years.
They moved with precision. An army trained in the deserts and mountains of North Africa. Men who knew how to strike fast, adapt quickly, and outmaneuver bigger forces. They didn't just win battles. They changed warfare.
They brought advanced siege techniques, new forms of architecture, and even early incendiary weapons such as flamethrowers to Europe. And it was all rooted in a warrior code, an ethos that married Islamic duty with African honor. Even when the Christians came for them, they held the line for centuries. They didn't just survive, they influenced, left behind systems, styles, and strategies that Europe later claimed as its own.
But that warrior sage archetype, that wasn't just in North Africa. Let's slide west to the Mali Empire, one of the richest and most sophisticated civilizations in the world. It wasn't built on bravado and trade alone. It was built through military strategy and political finesse.
Enter Sundiata Keita.
A man born with disability, exiled from his home, who came back with vision, faith, and a deep understanding of war. He unified fragmented kingdoms with a disciplined military, balanced cavalry and infantry, and a reputation that made enemies hesitate. He wasn't just a king. He was a mythic figure, a warrior of destiny.
And then there's Songhai, which took the legacy and scaled it even bigger. Sunni Ali was a general with river navies, siege techniques, and mobile armies that moved like smoke. He didn't just conquer land, he took Timbuktu back from the Tuareg and turned Songhai into a military juggernaut.
His successor, Istayu Muhammad, professionalized the whole system. He set up governors, garrisons, and fortresses. He was building infrastructure while still moving like a tactician. We see in these histories, Moorish, Malian, and Songhai, is that African greatness was never one-dimensional. It was never just spiritual or intellectual or economic. It was all of that. And it was military. It was organized. It was strategic. We built. We taught. We defended. We didn't just exist. We protected what we built.
When a system tries to erase you, you find ways to prove you exist. Some of us find pride in our bodies, others in the brotherhood of the street, some in faith, and some in silence.
Let's be real. For a lot of us, manhood was handed down with some missing pieces. Some of us had men around, but never felt seen. Some of us even had fathers in our homes. Some of us never had a father in the home. So we learned manhood through absence or pain. We're both hyper visible and invisible at the same time. We're seen as threats, for we're seen as sons, stereotypes, before we're nurtured. When it comes to manhood, a lot of what we've inherited is survival based. Be strong. Don't cry. Handle your business. Mentorship is that first spark. It's when an older dude, like your uncle or your barber or your coach or even your friend's dad, pulls you to the side and drops some real wisdom on you. Not that man up nonsense, but something deeper. Something with love behind it. Sometimes it's organized, like from programs like My Brother's Keeper or 100 Black Men of America or even Knights of Pythagoras. Those spaces matter. But more often, it's informal. It's that one conversation in the car. It's showing up for a kid who ain't yours just because you see him struggling. That's mentorship too.
Despite everything thrown at them, dehumanization, displacement, mass criminalization, Black men have always found ways to redefine manhood, to not just survive, but build each other up. And that's where mentorship, fatherhood, and brotherhood step in. Not as feel-good concepts, but as deliberate strategies for liberation. Now, let's talk about fatherhood. We're not just talking biology. We're talking about political resistance, emotional legacy, spiritual work. For Black men, being a father and having a father is deeply political, because for centuries, this country tried to sever that bond. From slavery to mass incarceration to economic policies that destabilize Black families, fatherhood has been attacked by design. And even with all of that, Black men, they still show up.
My kids are my best creation. They are an integral part of me. I didn't have a roadmap to perfect dad status. I had some ups and downs and plenty of missteps. But the love of my children made me a better man. We went through some hard times, but through all of the sacrifices and the struggles, I was able to build a stable and beautiful life for my kids. We laughed and we cried together. But the kids always seem to remind me what's important. And it's that battle with the ego to think of them before thinking of myself. But even so, I still wonder if I did a good enough job. Did I instill everything they needed? Have I set a good enough example? These are complex calculations when it comes to molding a human being, something I tried to get right throughout their short childhood. My wish and hope was that they arrived at adulthood with a stable mindset, disciplined, ambitious, strategic, empathetic, giving, kind, and unselfish. Fatherhood is not a cakewalk, but it is one of the most impactful institutions of our society. I'm proud to have been a dad. I'm very proud of the young adults my kids have become.
And then, there's this persistent myth, one that's been weaponized by the media, politicians, and I hate to say it, but even internalized by us, that Black fathers are absent, that they're just not around. But the truth, Black fathers are some of the most present, and engaged fathers in the country. And the stats back it up. And ladies and gentlemen, that is not opinion. That's CDC data that folks like to try to skip over.
In a 2013 report from the CDC's National Center for Health Statistics, which surveyed over 3,900 fathers of different races, 70.4% of black fathers said they bathed, diapered, or helped dress their kids every day, compared to 60% of white fathers. 82.2% said they played with their children every day. And over 40% helped with homework regularly, higher than white and Hispanic counterparts.
And black fathers who live with their children were more involved in many aspects of caregiving than white and Hispanic fathers. Even among non-residential black fathers, those who didn't actually live in the household with their children, black dads were still most likely to maintain regular contact.
67% saw their children at least once a month. And many reported talking to or exchanging texts with their kids several times a week. Let that sink in.
So why all this misinformation?
The absent black father myth persists largely because it's based on household presence, not actual engagement. So if a father doesn't live in the same house, he's labeled absent, even if he's picking up his kids from school every day, texting them good night, or paying child support faithfully. The rise of co-parenting outside of marriage, which has become more common, doesn't equate to disinterest or abandonment.
This isn't just a personal issue. It's political and historical. During slavery, black men weren't allowed to legally marry or parent, and children were sold off to break bonds. In the 20th century, welfare policies penalized women for having a man in the home.
Partly because of the general rule that welfare is cut off if there is a man in the house, fathers are often driven away so that mother and children can eat.
85% of the head of household is a woman, because most of the men who should be in the household, they cannot make a decent living. And of course it is better to know that a child will be fed 12 months out of the year than 3 months, which during the summer when construction work you can make a decent living.
The man in the house rule was written to prevent welfare cheating, to make sure that aid to families with dependent children would go only to families headed by mothers. But the effect of the man in the house rule is to create for children an atmosphere of investigation and surveillance. And thus, the welfare system in its operation turns out to be a system to make life harder for children.
And in fact, incentivizing father absence. The war on drugs and mass incarceration policies in the 80s and 90s ripped black fathers from their families. Today, structural inequality in jobs, housing, and healthcare still undermines stability for black families.
Being a black father is more than just being present. It's about healing, redefining masculinity, and breaking generational cycles. Fatherhood gives us an opportunity to teach emotional literacy, helping our sons cry, name emotions, and feel without shame. We can model softness and care, not just toughness and survival. And we can show our daughters what love looks like without control, violence, or domination. This isn't just parenting, it's cultural resistance.
So when we talk about black fathers, we're not just talking about men raising kids. We're talking about black men doing radical healing work in a world that tried its best to erase them from the family tree. And they're doing it with intention, with love, and fire in their hearts.
And then there's the Brotherhood, fraternal codes of engagement, the institutions we built when we weren't allowed into theirs. Prince Hall Freemasonry, for example, founded in the 1700s, after black men were shut out of white lodges. But instead of begging for entry into theirs, we made our own. And these lodges became spaces of resistance, self-mastery, and transformation. Quiet as it's kept, a lot of our freedom fighters, Du Bois, Thurgood Marshall, John Lewis, just to name a few, were Masons.
Then you got the Divine Nine fraternities, the Alphas, the Omegas, the Kappas, the Iotas, and the Sigmas. And they aren't just party organizations or step shows. They're cultural powerhouses, legacy networks, spaces where black men can build identity with structure, ritual, purpose. And they have produced generations of black leaders, thinkers, and change makers.
And for a lot of brothers, these organizations are the first place they experience communal masculinity that isn't toxic, performative, or destructive. It's a version of manhood rooted in care, accountability, and collective elevation. But these spaces give black men codes of conduct and a sense of belonging that a wider world often denies us. It's a sense of empowerment that allows us to focus further into our wider organizations of unity, leaning into political and cultural movements like Pan-Africanism or liberation theology and Hotepism, not just to fight the system, but to piece together a version of manhood that feels powerful, rooted in all hours.
Before we talk about what black men are becoming, we gotta sit with what they've been trying to reclaim. Because somewhere between the trauma and the timeline, between the meme and the march, are men who are looking for themselves. Some turn to Hotep, others to Pan-African flags waving in the wind, and still others turn to pulpits and prophets, to politics of the soul. Each one, if you will, is a map back to the self that white supremacy tried to erase.
Pan-Africanism is the belief that all people of African descent, whether you're in Lagos, Nigeria, or Atlanta, Georgia, or Kingston, Jamaica, or London, share a common destiny. Becoming a man under this tradition means you lead your people, but you don't dominate them. You protect, not with brute force, but with wisdom. You build wealth, not for your ego, for your community. It's about channeling the energy of our ancestors, warriors, scholars, kings, into real action today.
The core principles of Pan-Africanism is black unity across borders, recognizing that oppression affects all people of African descent, regardless of geography. It's about cultural reclamation and reviving African languages, spiritual systems, and identity beyond Eurocentric norms.
Pan-Africanism demands political sovereignty in advocating for independent African governance and resisting neocolonialism, as well as global strategy for linking struggles in the US, Caribbean, South America, and Africa under one vision of freedom.
Pan-Africanism began gaining momentum in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, particularly as African nations struggled under colonial rule and African diasporic populations faced systemic oppression in the Americas and Europe. It came alive in the 1900s when thinkers like W.E.B. Du Bois connected black struggles in America to those in Africa.
Then you had Marcus Garvey preaching Africa for the Africans and building a global black movement. Later, revolutionaries like Kwame Nkrumah, Malcolm X, and Patrice Lumumba turned Pan-Africanism into a political weapon against colonialism and white supremacy.
And if you want a modern example, think no further than Nipsey Hussle.
Let's talk about what it means to live your politics, not just post them. Because some folks wave Pan-African flags all over social media, but rarely is it a lived experience. But Nipsey Hussle wore it in his walk, in his business moves, in his blueprint for Black liberation. Nipsey embodied a modern form of Pan-Africanism by blending cultural pride, economic empowerment, and global Black solidarity into his life and legacy. While he may not have used the term Pan-Africanism overtly, his actions align deeply with its core principles.
Nipsey championed Black ownership, especially in his Crenshaw neighborhood. When Black futures got evicted block by block, he bought the strip mall that tried to push them out of it.
Now the 33-year-old rapper is paying it forward in Crenshaw.
My career started right here. This community put me on.
He used to sell his unsigned mixtapes out of the trunk of his car. Now,
You actually own half of this lot.
Yeah, me and my family.
he also owns Marathon Clothing Store.
His mantra, all money in and no money out, emphasized keeping wealth circulating within the Black community.
We playing a long game. We don't want the money to stop when we go. When we can't work no more, we want it to outlive us. We want it to be generational.
Nipsey says businesses are only part of the change. For true change, he's starting with kids at 59th Street Elementary, an area plagued by violence. He hired a local artist to help spruce up this basketball court, and an attempt to attract entrepreneurs to the community. His latest business venture is Vector 90, a co-working space in the Crenshaw district. Nipsey Hussle has given everything: hope, opportunity, and resources for his community to grind and succeed.
Nipsey worked to close the knowledge gap between Black communities and tech, positioning Black youth as architects of their own futures, a deeply Pan-African ethos.
Nipsey embraced his Eritrean heritage, visiting the country multiple times and building relationships across the diaspora. His identity as both African and African American highlighted the interconnectedness of Black struggles and triumphs worldwide, from LA in the US to Asmara.
He rejected mainstream definitions of success that centered on whiteness. Instead, he fused hip-hop with African pride, business with Black liberation, and street knowledge with ancestral wisdom. His music and message uplifted the importance of remembering where we come from to shape where we're going. His legacy is proof that the revolution isn't always loud. Sometimes it looks like Black ownership in a corner store or producing and distributing a mixtape. Sometimes it is a marathon and not a sprint.
But it's not all perfect. Some Pan-African spaces have been too male-dominated, ignoring the leadership of Black women or excluding LGBTQ folks. Others fall into elitism, all theory, no action.
At this point, I want us to sit with something uncomfortable for a second. Religion, especially Christianity, has long been used to pacify, to tell the oppressed, your reward is in heaven. Just suffer quietly down here.
But what happens when the oppressed start reading the same Bible differently? What happens when they flip it and instead of seeing submission, they see resistance? This is where liberation theology was born.
Yeah, that's right. That whole God ain't neutral stuff. Liberation theology says God takes sides. And if your God ain't on the side of the oppressed, then maybe you ain't praying to the right one.
Born out of the poverty-stricken barrios of the 20th century Latin America, liberation theology declared that God is not neutral in the face of injustice. God takes sides, and he chooses the side of the oppressed. In 1971, Gustavo Gutierrez, a Peruvian priest, wrote A Theology of Liberation and flipped the whole game. For Gutierrez, salvation just wasn't about the afterlife. It was about freedom now. He said God had a preferential option for the poor, not because the poor are more holy, but because they're more harmed.
That was the turning point. Faith was no longer just about personal piety anymore. It was about political transformation. This wasn't some fringe ideology. It caught fire. Leonardo Boff spreaded it in Brazil, and John Sobrino helped it take root in El Salvador. Even Camilo Torres, a Colombian priest, took it so seriously that he joined a guerrilla movement and ended up dying in combat. They weren't trying to destroy Christianity. They were simply trying to return it to the masses, to the people that it was always meant for.
And let's not forget, the Bible is full of revolutionaries. Moses led a slave revolt. Jesus was a liberator and a revolutionary who turned over tables, called out the empire, and stood with the poor. Cone said there's no such thing as a neutral gospel. The gospel is political. Liberation theology didn't rewrite scripture. It just read it honestly for the first time in a long time. This theology believed the church must actively work to dismantle systems of injustice, e.g., capitalism, racism, colonialism.
This theology changed the game. Christianity was no longer about personal salvation alone, but about collective freedom, salvation as resistance, and faith as fire.
Let's be real. For a lot of black folks in America, Christianity came wrapped in chains, a Bible in one hand and a whip in the other. Slave masters preached obedience while building empires off stolen bodies.
That servant which knew his Lord's will, and prepared not himself, neither did according to his will, shall be beaten with many stripes. Did you hear that? Stripes. That nigga who don't obey his Lord, that's his master, you see. That there nigga shall be beaten with many stripes. That's scripture.
So the question ain't new. How can black people believe in a God used to justify their suffering?
But here's the twist. Instead of throwing the whole thing away, some black theologians took parts of the Bible and flipped the script, because buried beneath all of that colonial doctrine was something powerful, something that could liberate, not just pacify. And for black men, it gave some who felt abandoned both by God and country a reason to pick up the pieces again.
In 1969, James H. Cone, a brilliant theologian from Arkansas, put it plain in his groundbreaking book, Black Theology and Black Power. And he didn't come to play respectability politics. Cone said, if God is real, then God is black. Not in skin tone, but in solidarity. God is wherever the oppressed are. And in America, that meant God wasn't siding with the system. He was in the streets, he was in the struggle, and he was in the fight.
There can be no reconciliation with masters as long as they are masters. No reconciliation as long as men are in prison. There can be no communication between the masters and the slaves until masters no longer exist as masters, are no longer present as masters. The Christian task is to rebel against all masters, destroying their pretensions to authority and ridiculing the symbols of power. However, it must be remembered that oppressors never take kindly to those who question their authority. They do not like thugs and bums, people who disregard their power, and they will try to silence them any way they can. But if we believe that our humanity transcends them and is not dependent upon their goodwill, then we can fight against them, even though it may mean death. Thank you.
Cone's theology was radical because it turned Christianity on its head. No longer was faith about enduring pain. It was about resisting it. The main core principles were God is on the side of the oppressed, period. Cone argued that if theology doesn't start from the lived experience of Black suffering and Black resistance, it's not just irrelevant, it's harmful.
In other words, if your church isn't talking about racism, poverty, or state violence, then it's preaching a gospel that serves whiteness, not justice.
Cone cracked the door, but others walked through it with their own truths. Reverend Dr. Katie Cannon took it further, asking how Black women fit into this theology that often overlooked them and founded womanist theology. Dwight Hopkins, Kelly Brown Douglas, and many others continued the work, pushing Black liberation theology to address capitalism, patriarchy, and queerness. This theology was never static. It evolved. It listened. It made room for the oppressed.
Not everybody embraced this. I mean, can we really liberate the soul using tools handed down by the oppressors? Is reclaiming Christianity a trap or a tactic?
And exactly how does this theology aid Black men? Well, for one thing, it gives us a language for our pain by reframing our trauma, not as personal failure, but as the logical outcome of systematic oppression. In essence, for some, it provides a spiritual and ethical framework for reimagining Black manhood by challenging toxic masculinity. Rather than adopting white patriarchal models of manhood, which often reward aggression, emotional suppression, and control. Liberation theology uplifts compassionate leadership, vulnerability, and community care as masculine virtues.
Pastors and activists like Reverend Otis Moss III promote a liberative model of Black masculinity rooted in love, justice, and accountability in a way that centers healing, justice, and wholeness. He addresses the psychological and social impacts of racism and historical trauma, as well as hypermasculinity and economic disenfranchisement.
Liberation theology also mobilizes social justice and political resistance. Black men involved in liberation theology often see activism as spiritual work. For example, the involvement of Black clergy in Black Lives Matter protests draws directly from liberation theology. Figures like Reverend Dr. William Barber II of the Poor People's Campaign are spiritual leaders who mobilize for economic justice and racial equity.
Liberation theology encourages a collective healing of historical trauma, including the trauma of emasculation, incarceration, and generational poverty. It intersects with Pan-African spiritual practices, Afrocentrism, and other cultural frameworks that uplift holistic wellness. Programs such as My Brother's Keeper, started by President Obama, combine spiritual reflection and mentorship and community service to redefine Black manhood, but are supported by faith-based communities.
But like many movements, liberation theology has its problems. For one, respectability politics often play out. In trying to prove the moral worth of Black men through Christianity, some expressions of Black liberation theology lean toward unintentionally shaming those who fall outside traditional norms, such as the formerly incarcerated men, or queer men, or even those who reject traditional religious faith.
Like many other Black political movements, much of Black liberation theology has historically placed Black male pastors at the center, often excluding or diminishing the voices of Black women and LGBTQ folks, who have also carried the movement. In an era of rising secularism and spiritual pluralism, its church-based framework may feel a little outdated or limiting for younger generations of Black men seeking meaning outside of Christian institutions.
But now, guys, we're going to switch gears. We're going to slide from religion into a movement that is a bit controversial. This one's complicated. You probably heard someone say, "Oh, he's a Hotep," like it's a joke or something. Because if you say Hotep now, folks laugh. It's like a punchline, a slur for the overwoke, the misogynists, or the hotel YouTube scholars.
But what does Hotep really mean? And why does it matter when we talk about Black manhood today?
Let's break it all the way down. The truth, the critics, and how we get back to the sacred root of the Hotep philosophy. The word Hotep comes from ancient Kemet, what we now call Egypt, and it means peace or to be satisfied. It wasn't slang, it was sacred. You see names like Imhotep, a genius, architect, priest, and healer, and it tells you how deep the roots go. It was commonly used in names in religious texts to denote a state of spiritual harmony, truth, and cosmic order called Ma'at.
In its original sacred context, Hotep represented spiritual alignment with divine order, communal responsibility, respect, wisdom, healing, and intellectual leadership.
The modern Hotep movement grew primarily during the mid-20th century Black consciousness movements, drawing influence from Pan-Africanism, Afrocentrism, Nation of Islam teachings, and Kemetisms, or ancient Egyptian spirituality.
It reclaims African identity and historical excellence, emphasizing pride in Black heritage, natural living, traditional family values, anti-colonial thought, and a rejection of Eurocentric education and societal norms. The modern Hotep ethos often intersects with masculinity, promoting an ideal of the conscious Black man as a protector, teacher, and spiritual leader.
It became a way to reconnect with a model of masculinity rooted in leadership, wisdom, discipline, and protection of the community. However, when stripped from its sacred roots, it can devolve into dogma, machismo, and conspiracism. And let's be real, the modern Hotep stereotype, it didn't come out of nowhere.
It got lost somehow and turned from spiritual to patriarchal, from balance to bravado, and from sacred feminine energy to sit down and submit. Instead of balance between man and woman, which was sacred in ancient Kemet, you get men demanding submission and ignoring women's power, promoting hyper-masculine ideals and placing men at the top of rigid gender hierarchies. Women are often expected or reduced to roles of childbearing and support. Feminist thinkers argue this contradicts the balanced duality of Isis and Osiris, Ma'at and Ra, which is present in ancient African cosmologies.
Other Hoteps push anti-science, conspiracy culture, or judge anyone who doesn't fit a strict, narrow version of Blackness. Anti-science rhetoric such as denial of vaccines, belief that all modern ills are due to the system, can spiral into unfounded conspiracy theories. Distrust in Western medicine and academia sometimes leads to misinformation.
Then there is elitism and gatekeeping. Hotep circles may marginalize Black individuals who are LGBTQ, feminist, or secular, labeling them as lost or westernized. The Hotep movement, at its best, is a reclamation of Black divinity, identity, and discipline. But at its worst, it simply plays into the ideal set by the white patriarchy.
The challenge and opportunity is to reawaken the original spirit of Hotep, one that unites ancient African principles with inclusive critical, and compassionate modern consciousness. But the true Hotep isn't about being louder or more woke. It's about being in balance. Imhotep wasn't yelling in the comments. He was building, healing, and teaching. That's the model for the modern man. If you lived Hotep for real, you respect the divine feminine, speak truth, and do the research. Lead by service, not ego. It's time to take it back to the source, not memes. Ma'at, not posture. Peace.
So what does all this tell us?
Each of these frameworks, from the historical example of the Moors to the blessing of fatherhood and the destiny of brotherhood, to the empowerment of Pan-Africanism, to the reimagining of Christianity through the lens of Black Liberation Theology, and to the ancestral wisdom of the Hotep, offers a powerful alternative to white supremacist masculinity.
But each also carries baggage, whether it's romanticizing the past, reinforcing patriarchy, or falling into elitism or abstraction. The work of modern Black manhood lies in learning these traditions while evolving them, making space for healing, complexity, gender justice, and a redefinition of power that doesn't rely solely on domination.
By redefining manhood, not through the lens of power over others, but through self-knowledge, healing, and accountability, Black men can begin to shed the performance and reclaim a version of masculinity that affirms life rather than mirrors the systems designed to destroy. If you're a Black man watching this, just know you don't have to carry all this alone. There are brothers walking this path beside you. Some ahead, reaching back, and some behind, watching how you move. This isn't about being perfect. It's about being whole. So let's keep moving, and let's keep building.
We were never meant to just survive. We were meant to create, to father, to protect, to love. We've worn the cross too long. It's time we remembered the crown.
Black men no longer have to wait for permission to heal. We free ourselves to love differently because, let's be real, a lot of what's called manhood in our community has been shaped by survival, not thriving. Hypermasculinity, emotional shutdown, these aren't traits of free men. They're traits of men still locked in invisible cages. We're creating our own spaces, our own templates, our own rituals of becoming, whether it's through mentorship, fatherhood, or fraternal bonds. What we're doing is rebuilding manhood in our own image. And that image, it's not stoic, it's not violent, it's not broken, it's layered, it's accountable, it's rooted in love.
Being a Black man, it's not a crisis, it's a calling, not defined by rage, but by remembering. We're not what they fear. We are what they forgot. And now we rise.